Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. For first-time visitors to New York City, the typical tourist guidebook is certain to recommend visits to the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, and Fifth Avenue. But how about a hospital in the Bronx, a basketball court on Sixth Avenue, a housing project in Queens, and a warehouse on Staten Island? These are some of the sites included in A People's Guide to New York City. Written by 3 City University professors, it focuses on the social dynamics of the city and how struggles between the haves and have-nots have shaped the landscape of the city. Carolina Bank Muńoz, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and one of the co-authors, will explain why the guide was written and what it hopes to accomplish. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to mention that I wrote this book with 2 wonderful co-authors, Emily Thompson Molina and Penny Lewis. And I think for us, one of the really inspiring things started with a trip I had to Los Angeles, where I went to hear Laura Pulido talk about A People's Guide to Los Angeles. And I was kind of struck by the idea of an academic writing an alternative guidebook. And I, that stuck in my head, and I came back to New York and I thought, I wonder if this project is happening in New York. And I reached out to the authors of the LA Guide, and they said, no, we've been looking for somebody in New York to write a guidebook, but everybody that we talk to in New York wants to focus on either Manhattan or Brooklyn or Queens, and nobody wants to write a guidebook of the whole city.
Right.
So I said, well, why not? Let's do it.
And 10 years later?
And 10 years later, we have a guidebook.
Okay. In your introduction, you write that guidebooks, quote, are inherently political because they highlight some perspectives while overlooking others. How are the perspectives that are highlighted in your guide different from the perspectives we might find in traditional guides?
Yeah, so our guide really focuses on the people who make up New York City, right? That traditional guidebooks focus on glitz and glamour and capital and power, and our guidebook takes the position of power from below, right? Who are the people who make up New York City? Who are the workers? Who are the artists who contribute to the life of the city?
How did you go about choosing the sites that you feature in the book?
It was really challenging, as you might imagine. New York City has so much history and so much depth and so many layers and so many boroughs that it was a challenge to be able to get it into one guidebook. So we had an advisory committee, and that advisory committee was comprised of intellectuals and activists and folks who could offer different perspectives on the city. And they really helped us shape the first, iteration of the sites. And then we took it from there and we said, what's missing from here, right? What places are missing? What stories aren't being told? And we expanded and we pared down to eventually come to around 150 sites.
You write that the story of New York is partly a story about disappearances, about vanishing. That's one of the themes of the book. Explain what you mean and give some examples of the sites that show that.
This is something that other authors have also written, right? That in New York City, and I think COVID has really highlighted this, that it is a city where important places disappear either because they're not financially viable or because developers want to build something, bigger and taller and better in them. And you can walk through the city and see it changing kind of in a daily way on your walk, right? So there's vanished sites, but there's also the book tells stories of the vanishing piece, but the book also tells stories of sites that continue to exist, but we think of them from an alternative perspective, right? So in terms of vanishing, one of my favorite sites is the Silver Palace restaurant in Chinatown. This is the first restaurant that was organized, or the first Chinese restaurant that was organized by a union. And it was a really hard-fought campaign. It was a 9-month strike, and the workers won. You know, it's a story of workers winning. And eventually the restaurant closed down. And I think it was a Duane Reade that was, built
Right.
on that site. And then the Duane Reade was knocked down and a hotel was built on that site. And while they were excavating for the hotel, they discovered remnants of like Washington's Tavern in the excavation, right? I think the importance of that story is how things disappear, but how things get kind of created and recreated.
Right.
So
right.
the remnants of Washington's Tavern are now, instead of it being like a public, something that's owned by the citizens of New York, it's being used privately in this hotel on the second floor in a gallery.
Right.
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 So layers of struggle and capital, right, all in one location.
The Christopher Street Pier is now, I bike along the west side and I go past Christopher Street, and I at one point was used to seeing a lot of young, gay, mostly Black and Latino and transsexual men. I don't see them anymore, but I gather that at one time there was a huge congregation of gay men who hung out there and sunbathed there, and
Yeah.
in time gone by.
This is an example of what gets lost with gentrification, right? So we had these kind of vibrant neighborhoods and spaces where people could congregate, and often spaces where marginalized people could congregate that disappear because they're not seen as moneymakers, right?
Right,
They're not.
right.
They're not attractive. They're not. They might be considered dangerous by some, right? And they get wiped out. And now it's it's lovely to bike along the West Side Highway.
And they've done great things with the waterfront that you have access to that you did before, but some things have been lost.
Exactly, and it sometimes can feel somewhat sterile,
Another theme that you write about is a lot of sites and former sites have been created by racial conflict and class struggles. One example is 509 Fifth Avenue. I don't know what it is now, but it was the former home of the Colored Orphans Asylum, which was destroyed in the
Draft riots.
In the draft riots. Tell us about that, and do you know what's there now?
I don't know what's there now. I think it's one of those in-between spaces where there's like buildings. It's not a address that exists. It's not a building that exists. It's
Right.
several buildings. And in fact, that orphanage got moved way up north, I think to Riverdale for a while, and then closed down. But that's.
But it was basically burned down.
Yep.
In the draft riots, where a lot of Irish, poor Irish, who learned that rich people were now going to be able to pay not to have to go into the Union Army, and they couldn't afford to, and they took out their anger largely on Black members of the city.
Absolutely.
And burned down the Colored Orphanage and lynched some Black people. Another site that you mentioned is, and I'd never heard of, Julio Rivera Corner, 37th Avenue and 78th Street in Jackson Heights, Queens. Tell us about that.
We think of Queens as a quintessential kind of immigrant city nowadays. It didn't used to have that reputation. It used to have the Archie Bunker, kind of white working class Queens reputation. But there's a vibrant, Latino community, Latinx community in Jackson Heights. There's also a very vibrant LGBTQ community in Jackson Heights. And Julio Rivera was a gay man who was murdered in Queens. And for a long time, the city didn't do anything about it, right? They weren't looking for who had killed Julio Rivera. It was a story that was kind of pushed under the rug. And the LGBT community in Queens really rose up and pushed it to center focus. And because of their organizing and getting politicians involved and getting the family members involved and launching, the Queens Pride Parade, they were able to get enough attention to the story. And now there's Julio Rivera Corner so that people in New York City can learn about this incredible person.
Why Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx? Why is that included?
Lincoln Hospital is such an incredible story of people, of resilience, right? Of marginalized communities not having access to health care, not having access to basic human rights. And the takeover at Lincoln Hospital to say, we've had enough. We need more resources. We need better resources.
The takeover by the young lords.
By the young lords,
right.
Yes, is such an incredible part of the city and is such an incredible part of that era, right? Because we saw the garbage offensive, also by the young lords. At a similar time period, we're seeing the Ebinger boycott in Brooklyn around racial discrimination in the workplace. So, people taking, making the city their own and demanding rights is a big part of the book and a big part of the Lincoln Hospital story and a huge win for the community.
Right. I really perked up when I saw that you included the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island. Why?
So when we started writing that entry, we were really drawn to the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island because workers there were fighting for better health and safety during the pandemic, right? The Amazon was not doing what it needed to do to ensure the health and safety of workers in any of its warehouses. And workers at that warehouse said, this is not okay. Little did we know when we wrote it that a few years later, there would be an organizing drive, a union organizing drive in that warehouse that succeeded, the first in the country to organize and win against this giant, transnational company.
And this is a place that I've passed many times, and I'm glad you included in the book, the basketball court at West 4th Street that hosts the the West 4th Summer Pro Classic League, the oldest summer basketball program in the city. Many times, I guess going down to the, what's the theater there? Is that the IFC? And you see people playing basketball, right across the street, and people, outside the chain link fence, lined up to see that. It's really a cultural event,
absolutely,
in the city.
And I think one of the things that we wanted to highlight in the book, we spend a lot of time highlighting politics, but a central part of life in New York City is also leisure, right? And that's an example of that, right? Community spaces, spaces of leisure, spaces of gathering. Part of what makes leisure an important story is because of the battles that were fought for unionization, for the 8-hour workday, to open up spaces of leisure, right? To not have a system in the city where people don't have time off, back in the day.
Right.
That allowed opening for the creation of recreational spaces, for the creation of public beaches, for all kinds of activities in the city, music, art, theater, etc.
You did include, one of the entries is the Empire State Building, which would be included in any guide to New York City. But one thing that surprised me concerned the people who worked on, we knew a lot of European immigrants worked on building the Empire State Building, but I didn't know about the Mohawk iron workers who came here from Canada to work on the building, and I guess could walk those, high, narrow spaces up there, and who went on from there to form their own community out in Brooklyn.
Yeah, the iron workers, so that's a great example of one of the alternative stories we tell in the book, right? Everybody knows the Empire State Building, but they may not know this story about the First Nations, the Mohawk First Nations people. And for us, it was so important to find those alternative stories because they are, hidden in history. Students learn about the Empire State Building all the time, but they don't learn this part of the Empire State Building. It's the same thing with the Statue of Liberty, right? We tell the story of the Statue of Liberty. Everybody, that story is always, the welcoming of immigrants. But the story that isn't told about the Statue of Liberty is the fact that women were not allowed to be part of the opening ceremony. We're not allowed to be on the island.
Really?
Yes. And so the various women's groups of the time rented steamboats and came out and blew their horns and protested not being allowed on the island. I mean, here was this giant statue of a woman.
Of a woman, right.
And to not let women be part of that opening ceremony was...
Wow. Why the Queensbridge housing project in Long Island City?
We really wanted to tell the story of public housing in New York City, and that is such a massive structure. It's
the largest housing project in the country?
In the country, absolutely. And this is something that I think people in New York City, and certainly people who live outside of New York City, don't realize. New York City continues to this day to have the most and the best public housing in the country. And those are New Deal policies, right? And even though public housing has been divested and there's not enough of it and the conditions in public housing are not terrific, there's a lot of repairs that need to be made to public housing. The fact that it exists and that that we've been able to maintain it and hold on to it allows working class people and poor people to still live in this city.
Because without it, they wouldn't, there's fewer and fewer places for them to
Exactly.
live. And if you look at cities like Chicago, where the public housing stock was in such bad shape that they demolished most of it. Mm-hmm. You write that to find authentic New York, one must necessarily look to the outer boroughs. What do you mean by that?
Most traditional guidebooks focus on Manhattan, and there's a lot of good reason to focus on Manhattan. Its density, its concentration of cultural and arts institutions, its history. But Manhattan really concentrates, wealth and power and capital in ways that when you move to the outer boroughs, you get a better sense of the city, of who lives in the city, of who works in the city, of the innovation, of the creativity, of the life of the city in ways that you don't see that in Manhattan. And each of the boroughs, I would say, Brooklyn is very hip right now, so there's a lot of focus on Brooklyn, and in a lot of ways, Brooklyn has become kind of Manhattanized, right? People would say. But each of the boroughs, the Bronx, Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, all really contribute to the vibrancy of the city. And each of them is so different in their own right. in terms of economics, in terms of culture, in terms of who lives there, in terms of inclusion and exclusion. So to understand New York City, you really have to look at the whole city, even though we want to look at its component parts.
Did you learn things from researching the guide that surprised you?
Constantly. Constantly. And, Penny is a native New Yorker and has such deep knowledge of New York. And it was interesting to watch her also kind of explore some of these things and learn from the history. It turns out I knew so little about New York City. And I think some of just learning about sites that went kind of missing and that people don't know about, or watching the evolution of sites, like the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn. When I first moved to New York City in 2004, it was the 3 or 4 houses that they had rescued. Now there's a whole cultural institution connected to it.
Right. This was a community of free blacks who lived in Brooklyn. Is this meant to be a guide for tourists, or is it meant for New Yorkers, or who's it meant for?
We really struggled with that question when we were writing it, because we want it to be for everybody, right? We want New Yorkers to read it and to see themselves in it. We also want them to say, hey, why didn't you include, this site or that site? What about my neighborhood? Why isn't my neighborhood included in this book? We want tourists to see New York from a different perspective, to have an understanding of the, quote unquote, real New York, of what it means to live in the city versus visit the city. And we also, wanted it to be able to be used as a tool in the classroom.
Which you do.
Which I do in my classes at Brooklyn College, but could also be used in high schools and middle schools. Getting students to think about their environment is so important, right? For me, one of the driving motivations for the book was that I have students all the time who say, oh, I come from, say, Brownsville. There's nothing interesting about Brownsville. There's nothing, it was a crummy place to grow up. And then we talk about Brownsville and we look at the sites. Brownsville was the home to Margaret Sanger's first birth control clinic. Brownsville was the home to the Labor Lyceum, where activists and scholars came and talked about socialism. Brownsville was the home to all kinds of activism of the time, to I think the first children's library. So there's so much richness in these neighborhoods that if you're not scratching the surface, you're not going to see. And so for people to experience that about their neighborhoods, to learn about their neighborhoods, and to challenge, but also to challenge, the guidebook, what's written about their neighborhoods, is, I think, really inspiring and exciting.
Well, I certainly learned a lot from it that I didn't know. And, I may be out there with my guidebook going to some of these places and learning the history that I had not known before. And so thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much.
It's really a great guide. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'd like to thank Carolina Bank Muńoz, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and co-author of A People's Guide to New York City, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.